Well, good morning. It's particularly wonderful to be here to speak with you because I immediately feel at home with a group of people who already understand the power of metaphor, and particularly clients' own metaphors. So I'm delighted to be sharing the information with you about clean language and where it came from and what it's about, the who's, the what's, and the whys. I'm going to try to discipline myself not to get into the hows, although I get very excited about that. But I am doing a workshop later in the day with EAGALA team, Patty Schlau and Michelle Schraff, and we're going to be talking about some of the hows of using this model in the arena. But I'm here this morning. Lynn asked me to talk about more where all this came from and what the thinking is behind it. I'm too close? I'm not close enough? Okay. It was fun to hear these, fun to hear these comments already this morning, because did you notice how rife they were with metaphors? We had everything from the Three Stooges to the Three Musketeers to snow and the implications of that, and then the very subtle things that Lynn picked up about the word with and how with implies some metaphors potentially, connection and togetherness and so forth. And clean language is a lot about subtlety, the subtlety of language. So wait. Now, Kathy just showed me 3 different ways to change slides. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about, as I said, the who, the what's, and the whys. I'm going to talk about who David Grove was. Sadly, he passed away in 2008 at the young age of 58. But who he was and what he got curious about working with clients, and the theory, the model he came up with as to how people actually are structured and how we work and how we change. And then talk about his metaphor therapy concepts, his clean language processes, and the later work, which you may not be familiar with, there's not much written about it, which was the last 6 years of his life he spent doing what he called emergent knowledge processes, which I think have particular application in the EAGALA model. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the overlap with clean language and EAGALA. I don't profess to be an expert on the EAGALA model, so I'll do what I can with that. And I do want to preface my remarks by saying I am presenting the Grovian way of working cleanly. So the do's and don'ts that I'm talking about are, I think, what Grove would have said, and to work from that clean language, capital C, capital L model. And it may or may not be exactly the way you work with your clients in your context. There's some differences when you work with groups. There are differences when you're working with psychoactive space, when you're working, taking a client and having it project into space as opposed to working in a purely talking mode. So take what's useful and think about what I'm saying and apply it as it works for you. So talking about David Grove, he was originally from New Zealand, of European and Maori descent. I find that Maoris are I guess you use the term Aboriginal group in New Zealand. Interestingly, dreams are very important, is my understanding, in the Maori culture. And so I find it fascinating that here's a person who really focused on the idea of using symbols and how people actually use them in managing the world. Coming from a tradition that includes dreams and looking for them as to omens and for their symbols of good fortune, and taking them quite seriously. So David did study here in the United States. He got his master's in counseling psychology from the University of Minnesota. He taught here often. He traveled extensively. He and his, at that time, wife and co-psychotherapist, partner, and developer of his early work, Kai Davies Lynn, owned a piece of property in Missouri, about 10 acres, I understand, where they worked with a lot of clients and did a lot of experimenting with the various concepts he had for clean language and ways to strategically ask questions and direct clients. His background before developing clean language was largely in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and this is very popular work with a lot of NLPers. With Erickson, Milton Erickson's hypnosis. Erickson used a lot of metaphors, but he used his own metaphors that he gave to the clients. And David really went off on quite a different tangent. I unfortunately never met David. I got involved with Clean Language in 2003, so I had 5 years, but little did I know it was only going to be 5 years that he was around. And unfortunately, I never afforded myself of the opportunity to work with him, but I have a lot of good friends who knew him very well, and I have lots of David stories. He was pretty eccentric. Very much the innovator, insatiable curiosity. He didn't do much writing. There is a book published in his name. I kind of explain that. It's David Grove and Basil Panzer, who has also passed away. And the way one person who knew them well expressed it, he said, Basil took David into a room, locked him in for 3 days, and fed him, and taped what he said. Because David was the kind of person, I get the impression, he didn't want to be bothered a lot with writing things down. He was like, well, that's what I said yesterday, but what about tomorrow? I've got this new idea. So writing and honing the way you have to do for a book, I can see why David didn't do a lot of writing. There are a couple of articles. By the way, if you look in the app, the EAGALA app, I've listed resources at the end of my talk with some books and websites and things where you can find more information. There are a couple of articles written by David. You notice that most of them are co-written, so I have a feeling I know who did most of the talking and who did most of the writing. But at any rate, he was a very innovative person. So when you ask someone even who knew him well, you know, what did David do in thus and such a situation? The answer is likely to be, on which day are you asking me about? You know, in fact, I've had numerous people tell me he would get up in a place like this. He taught by demonstrating, and he'd say, now I'm going to show you, you know, X, Y, Z, and he'd proceed to get up and do something completely different. Which in a way couldn't be modeling clean more purely, because what he was doing was responding in the moment to the client. But it's kind of frustrating when you're trying to learn. So he was quite the innovator. It was in the 1980s that he was doing a lot of work with trauma survivors that he first began to develop his metaphor theory. A lot of them were returning vets from Vietnam, and I believe also sexual abuse survivors. And he noticed how many times these clients used metaphors to talk about what had happened, or what it was like for them now. Not this is what happened to me, but it was like this. Now, the model at the time, in the 80s, for psychotherapy and dealing with trauma, was this concept of desensitization. You get the person to talk about what happened, maybe multiple times, and you do that until they are finally desensitized, or maybe there's something cathartic and you sort of work through it, to use a metaphor. And he was looking for a way to work with these clients. He thought, we should be able to find a way not to be risking this re-traumatization. From my metaphor is, it's like taking a shovel and just digging deeper and deeper into those neural pathway ditches of the trauma. So David was looking for a way to not do that. How do you help someone heal? And noticing their use of metaphor, he said, well, what if we asked questions of the metaphors themselves, rather than the client about what happened? And the theory, I guess the image I hold in mind is like the old-fashioned like wagon wheel that's got the spoke, what do you call the hub or something in the center, and then the spokes. So if you think of the metaphor as being the hub, all the things that are connected to that, all the experiences are like that, all the feelings, the emotions, the self-talk, everything that's connected to that experience that's like that metaphor. If you move the hub of a wheel, if you change that, everything else moves as well. You can't not affect the system.
So his theory is that we can ask questions of the metaphors and work with the metaphors themselves, and it will affect everything else related to that. So out of this group, party two, he's asking himself, how do people structure their inner realities? What role does metaphor play in this? It's not my metaphor, but I love this. Someone once told me, think of metaphor as like the zip drive. Here's another metaphor. If the wheel didn't work for you, here's another one. The metaphor is like a zip drive. And we come up with metaphors. Let's say, what's it like to be frustrated? It's like hitting my head against a brick wall. It's a pretty common one. So into the zip drive of the brick wall goes any experience in your life that's like that. So in goes the, when I was 2 years old and my mother wouldn't let me do what I wanted to do. In goes the third grade teacher. In goes that boss I had. In goes every experience that's related to those feelings and cognitions, and that whole experience goes into the zip drive. This is what David said. This is how we structure our inner realities. We've got this reference library, if you will, these zip drives, and when we meet a new experience that we want to figure out how to meet, we go to our reference. We go to this zip drive. So not only is it the experiences included there that are related, but all the coping strategies we've developed for how to handle that are in there. So that's how he's envisioning how we structure our internal realities. They're encoded in metaphors. So when you ask what information do people need to change and heal, well, he's saying you need access to those zip drives, to that reference library. The problem is they're held subconsciously, and most of us don't have access to them with just conscious talk. So what he's saying is, Lynn mentioned experiential therapies. You need to somehow get in touch with that subconscious material, and it's not likely to happen for you with just talk that's more cognitive. And then we're left with the question, well, how do we best help people access that? And that's where clean language comes from, or an answer. So, to summarize, how do we use metaphors? We use them to help us efficiently organize that subconscious information so you can find what you need, to make sense of a new experience by comparison. It was like that, that's how I handled this, that's how I'm going to handle this new experience. They help us develop our inner resources. Now, I could actually spend an hour talking about metaphors and resources, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly. But we get a little into the how. The how is some of the words that you're listening for from your clients. What do you ask them for metaphors of? And what ones do you want to bring their attention to? Well, one answer to those is you want to listen for the resourceful states. So resource might be calm. It might be relax. It might be energize. It might be confidence. It could be any number of things. And it's context specific. To be able to relax in one context is helpful. To be able to relax in another context may not be helpful. You got to get up and go. Laying back and relaxing is not resourceful in another context. So the metaphors, if you have that image, if you have those words, if you can connect with that inner resourceful sense of what it's like to be at ease or relaxed or confident, then that's helpful. And we use metaphors, as I said, to respond in the here and now. What do I go back and choose from my subconscious library to figure out how to meet the world? So another aspect, if you will, about what are you listening for from your clients? What kinds of metaphors? You're listening, not Grove suggested, not for the ones about content, not the history. He's saying that's not the story you're looking for. Going back and asking someone to give you lots of details about what happened and who did what to whom and when and so forth, he said it's actually not as helpful as you think it is. He's saying what we're listening for are the metaphors about how we process It's how the client copes. How does the client do depressed? How does the client do relaxed? How does the client make decisions? There's a sequence and a process. Helping a client discover their process gives them a resourceful tool they can use again and again with lots of different context and content. So we're looking at a process level. And for that, as I said, memory is not necessary. It's not the history. It's the inner story and structure. And insight's not necessary. And it may come with any of these sessions. A client gets some insight, but it's not what does the healing, Grove would say. Working at this process, at this organizational level, how's this person structuring their inner reality and what needs to change? Then you are working at a more comprehensive level, and a level that generalizes, because you're not just working with this one particular history and this one type of problem, but on a broader basis that they can apply to many. Now, remember the wheel. I mean, they are all connected. You can work on something specifically, and it's bound to impact it all, but you can go to the core much more quickly when you're thinking in terms of process, not content. I mentioned that one. So, what is a metaphor? I started my first iteration in this life. I was an English teacher many years ago, and so it's something I worked with my students a lot with. What was metaphor? So to give you, I hope, what's a helpful definition, is a metaphor equates one thing to a decidedly different thing in order to clarify the nature of the first thing's qualities and traits. Now, when you read that, I'm sure you'd have a hard time believing. I spent a long time trying to write that sentence, and it came out that complicated nonetheless. So let me break it down with an example. And very frequently, you'll find that what people are using metaphors for is they're trying to explain something abstract or conceptual, like a feeling. And how do you explain a feeling? You compare it to something that you've had some tangible experience with, because we live in the physical bodies, so we tend to use examples that their sense, their taste, their sight, their, whatever they might be. We somehow relate it to a physical experience. So let's take the phrase, my love is like a red, red rose. So you've got love, which is a conceptual emotion or feeling, and a rose, which obviously is a very different thing. And the purpose of comparing the two is because presumably there's some qualities of a rose that are like the love this person is trying to describe. So a rose, for example, is beautiful. A rose is fragile. A rose has thorns and can be painful. A rose doesn't last forever. So many different people could say this one sentence, and there are different aspects of the rose that they have in mind. What is it about the love they're trying to describe? What characteristics are true of both? So a metaphor, in a really short sentence, is a comparison of two unlike things. But that's an important part about it. It's about trying to explain one thing with the characteristics of another. Now, James Lawley and Penny Tompkins, the developers of symbolic modeling, divide metaphors into 4 types. Let me take a moment to digress. Lynn did mention symbolic modeling. Let me explain the difference between clean language and symbolic modeling. If you've done any research into this, symbolic modeling is a term you're going to come up. I started to say against. See, the problem with once you start getting really sensitive to metaphor, it's like almost no sentence that comes out of your mouth sounds exactly right. Not against, but you'll meet. So Penny and James are psychotherapists they live in London. Penny's actually an American. She's from Dallas, although she's now lived in the UK technically longer than she has in America. But I love the fact that she's lived in the UK 30 years, and you don't hear a touch of English accent in that voice. And I love the English accent. It's not that. It's just that she has stayed true. And it's a conscious decision. It has to be. You've been listening to the English accent for 30 years. She embraces her Texas roots. Penny and James first met David, I believe, somewhere in the mid-'90s, and were really intrigued by what he was doing. And they heard him again. This is the way he taught, was he would demonstrate. They came up to him after a demonstration, and they said, "We'd really like to talk to you about what you're doing. We're fascinated." And he said, "I don't like to talk about this stuff. I'm not interested." I mean, really blew them off. And he said, "But if you want to videotape me, fine. I just don't want to talk about this." And Penny said, and he didn't talk to them for a year. They spent 2.5 years taping sessions and then studying those sessions, question by question, not literally frame by frame, but, bit, and saying, what's David doing? What questions does he use most often? What questions does he use most often? And what kind of strategies does he seem to be employing as he's guiding his clients' attention through their content? And they came up with symbolic modeling, and added to it their own backgrounds in NLP, in systems thinking, and cognitive linguistics, and a variety of other things. So symbolic modeling is their term for a clean language process that has a specific, I don't mean to make it sound linear. It's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, but it has a strategy for where you're directing your client's attention. It's a change model that uses clean language as its tools. So I hope that clarifies the differences between the two. It uses clean language, but it's its own strategic model. And there are other people out in the world, such as Caitlin Walker, who presented in Florida this past January at an EAGALA event. She's got her own model of using clean language questions, but with a different strategy of where to go with them. But this is probably, the symbolic modeling is the dominant one in the world today. And Penny and James's website, which again I've given you in the resources, cleanlanguage.co.uk out of England, is the kind of informal international hub of clean language. It's a huge website with articles put in from all kinds of people, and tells you where trainings are taking place around the world, and they're kind of the center of training now that David's gone. So they identify 4 types of metaphors. And it's not important that you be able to label these in the arena as you're going by. It's not about, it's just about trying to get you to be more sensitive to noticing that there are other kinds of metaphors you're probably missing. So the first is overt metaphor. Well, that's like, my love is like a red rose. You immediately get an image, you could draw it, there it is. Most of us don't miss those in the arena, unless they're flying by, which sometimes they are, if the person's talking a lot. They're pretty easy to spot. The second type is embedded metaphors. And those are the ones that are more subtly embedded in our language. And Lynn gave a perfect example. Go with the flow. Now, you probably hear flow as a metaphor. That one's easy to spot. But are you thinking about with as a metaphor? And that's with like what? The third kind is embodied metaphor, and this is about the metaphors we all, your clients, have inside them. So confidence, for example, I usually find with clients confidence is in the spine. And it's usually, their metaphor is a tree, and it's usually one of 3 kinds. It's often an oak tree, which people associate with strength. If you ask them, and is there anything else about an oak tree, they'll say it's strong. Sometimes it's a willow or a palm tree because they're flexible and they bounce back from adversity. One time I had a client who had an apple tree. I was so excited. It's not a palm, it's not an oak, this is an apple tree. So what I mean by embodied is the person can locate it in their body. And what they do often in an EAGALA session, they're invited to project that embodied metaphor into the space around them. So the horse becomes the symbol for their confidence, or whatever that might be. And then the fourth type is nonverbal, which would mean anything from a sigh to a sound to a gesture. So let me give you some Other examples. So an overt one, an obvious, straightforward one, it's like I'm pushing against an immovable object. And you could have your client physicalize that, we say, physicalize it in the arena. And that would look like what? An embedded one. I misread his reaction. A lot of people would not notice that word misread. And it's reading. And, is there anything else about read and misread? Embodied. I have to hold myself back from telling her off. So there's a holding back. And if you ask someone, and whereabouts is that hold back? When you have to hold yourself back. For a new client, they're totally surprised to know they have an answer. They'll say, well, I don't know why I know this, but it's in my shoulders. And if you're really good, all right, Lynn, I challenge you, there's another embedded metaphor in that sentence. I have to hold myself back from telling her off. How many I's are there? There's an I who's doing the holding, and there's a myself who's being held. And in Grovian language, we would typically call that two metaphors. They're two selves. And so what kind of you is a you that holds yourself back? And what kind of a self is that self that you hold back? And I can tell you from experience that usually the myself is younger. It's often a child. It's the adult holding back. Maybe. So, how might that look in the arena? Sometimes, as I said, the embodied metaphor is projected out onto, could be a horse, could be an object, could be anything in the arena. And so, for example, in this first picture of the man with the horse right beside him, if you were asking him, and what's happening now, he might say, if I just listen to my gut, it always steers me right. I just have to get quiet and listen. So there the horse is his intuition, his knowing, whatever he's going to call it, and he's gotten quiet and he's listening. And usually a person wouldn't say to that all at once, I've kind of telescoped it. More likely, he might say, if I listen to my gut, it steers me right. And then it's going to take a couple clean questions to say, and what needs to happen for you to listen to your gut? And then he might go to say, I need to be quiet and listen. And can you be quiet and listen? And then a new problem might come up. He said, no, there's this voice in my ear, and I can't turn it off. And what kind of voice is the voice that's in your ear and you can't turn off? It's my Father's voice. The plot thickens. So let's take the equestrian, the woman on horseback. This might be an embodied metaphor of her saying, I have to hold myself back. So in this case, the I is the rider, and the horse is myself. That can happen. Any number of things could happen with number 3, which is why you ask and don't suggest an answer. She might be saying, when I relax, it's like those horses. I just shut out what's around me and do something quiet. Or she might be saying, that's how the kids at school treat me. They ignore me. They don't see me. So there are different ways of involving the horses and the way this might happen in the arena. So to summarize the metaphor therapy, Grove is saying, this is my phrasing, but metaphor is the language of the subconscious. If you want to communicate to the subconscious, talk in metaphor. And I swear sometimes I'm with clients and I think, the subconscious is going, yeah, you're listening, this is great. I have something else to tell you, and it's not what you thought you came here for, but you need to know this. Metaphors encode our experience, and our learning. And by our learning, I mean, how am I going to manage in the world? How am I going to cope? And you can get resourceful answers to that. I'm going to put my attention on my spine and feel that oak tree and I can go out into the world. Or it can be a maladaptive metaphor, particularly like inner child type metaphor. I'm just going to climb into this cardboard box in my heart and not look out ever again, and then I'll be fine, right? You find lots of inner children in the heart, behind shields, in caves, in treasure chests. Yeah, one of my favorite in the sense was the cardboard box, because it's what a childlike solution, a cardboard box that's going to keep you safe. So this is why Grove says metaphors, again, my phrase, not his, I have to be careful with that, but they're the subconscious directors and dictators. We don't know that our subconscious is going to that reference library and saying, just tuck your core self in your heart, keep your head down, and you'll be fine. Not all that helpful, and we don't know that that unhealed little part of ourselves is still dictating our strategy for meeting the world. And so then Grove is using the technique, asking himself, so what kind of experience can we give to people? How can we help them find these metaphors and experience them that can lead to this systemic change? So, in a pithy, twitterable phrase, change the metaphor, change the self. Okay, so where does that leave you as a therapist? And what I find when I'm training people, I have a model of training. We do 4 days on developing metaphors, what I call facilitating clarity, helping a client get to know their own metaphor world, and then another 4 days on facilitating change. And it's about day 3 that I start to see the foundation crack with some people who've been practicing for 20 or 30 years, because the paradigm is shifting. And as they get that experience of being a client, as they facilitate other people in the training group and they see things happening for other clients, they start saying, what have I been doing for 20 years? Grove was onto something about his understanding of the way people structure their inner realities. So my role as a therapist, what am I here to do? I'm not interpreting, I'm not, this is not CBT, I'm not giving them suggestions for cognitions to self-talk. What is my role? And I think Grove could have described it by saying the therapist's role in a clean model is to establish the right conditions and ask the right questions so the client can do the discovering and the learning about their metaphors and figure out what needs to change. So, what are the right kind of conditions? Well, you provide an opportunity for the client to make meaning. So for an EAGALA model, I'm preaching to the choir, right? This is why this fits so well. You create and establish the space, and by contents I mean like things in the space. So they might be poles or cones or fences and gates, and all kinds of things become the contents that a client can work with in a space. But provide them in a way that allows the client to adjust them to his needs. Trust the client. Trust the client's wisdom. Don't say, let me set this up for you, and this is what I want you to do. Say, basically, you can say it in a more clean language kind of way, but, here's your space, make use of whatever you like. And when your world is like, and what would that look like? The right conditions includes being a facilitator who stays out of the client's content. And then you've got facilitation tools and techniques, i.e. clean language questions, that don't pull the client out of his experience. So it's not about directing attention to what you're noticing and saying, can you comment on that? What's that like for you? But staying with the client. Don't draw him out of his own experience. If he's looking over there, then you should be looking over there. And what are the right kinds of questions? So now I'm going to talk about clean language. Clean language consists of simply worded questions. I'll give you some examples and you'll see. They're very simple. David used to say, people are very complex, so the question should be very simple. They're simply worded questions that you then sort of insert the client's words into. I've given you some examples. Confidence is in my spine. And is there anything else about confidence when it's in your spine? So other than the words of the client's words, the words are very simple. And notice there are no descriptive words that aren't the client's. None. David worked for 2 years, I understand, honing these questions down. So incredibly sensitive to the subtlety and nuance of language. How can he remove as much as possible the facilitator's worldview from the way the questions are worded? And I was chatting with our friends here from Israel and letting them know that clean language the questions have been translated into Hebrew, along with Japanese, German, Dutch, and French. That's what I'm aware of. And that's not a simple slapdash translation, because again, the subtlety is so precise, it takes a while to find out, there's not necessarily a word for exactly that in another language, and what was David trying to do, and what's the closest we can come to that? So, simply worded questions using the client's exact words. It uses a limited number of questions. And the symbolic modeling frameworks for change process that Penny and James developed, there are 12 basic questions. There's some others that are sort of permissible, if you will, but there are 12 basic ones. And there's a value I have come to appreciate deeply in limiting the number of questions you ask and in phrasing them exactly the same way every time, and not getting chatty with them. And that's because after a while, the client's sort of system comes to expect the question. They know what's likely to be coming. They don't have to use a nanobit, is that a word? But even a nanosecond of time to cognitively process the question itself. And there's a safety to having a limited number of questions. After a while, the client can begin to relax and realize you're not going to challenge them with something. Nothing's going to come at them they're not prepared for. And they can start to kind of, relax, let down that guard. And not just let down the guard, but the greatest compliment to me is when a client says, I forgot you were there. And just because you were just kind of like this voice. And part of that is because you're using the same questions. And I'm going to give you an example of using the same questions with 2 different clients and show you. Don't think it's limiting. It's really not. Clean language uses a special syntax and rhythm and pacing. Now, when David Groh developed clean language, his intention was to naturally induce a light trance state, so the person to be in greater connection, if you will, with their subconscious. And obviously that's not always appropriate. And so I say, qualify this with what your context is. And you want to be around horses, you don't necessarily want someone completely spaced out. Although, I assure people, I say, if they say, this is like trance, this is not like I'm going to have you quack like a duck and you won't know you did it. We're talking about just a deeply mindful sense of attention to your inner knowing. But there are ways to use clean, to phrase these questions more conversationally. And I don't think I'm going to have time to get into that today, and it's more like the how bit, but you can, so don't think it's all or nothing. I'm going to model for you. Clean language uses a lot of repetition, and there's a lot of value to that, and I will talk this afternoon about sort of more about why that. But repeating a person's words is a huge part of this, slowing them down, letting them hear their words again. And as they hear it, feeling those accompanying emotions. A big part of clean language is repetition. Okay, so clean language questions invite the clients to, this is David's term, psychoactivate the objects and spaces around them and inside them. What he means by psychoactivate is that space, and the objects in it that they select, that they've projected their inner experience onto those, or into those spaces, and they're engaging with that. That's what he means by the term psychoactive. So I'm sitting here now, and this area is not psychoactive for me. But if you ask me something about where are you going in your life in the next couple years, and how would that look, then suddenly I start working with that space psychoactively. I start projecting my knowing into it. I start to have a sense of length and the meaning and distance and how far. So that's what he means by psychoactivate. Okay, so let me give you 2 examples. And I'm not a horse person, and I'm up here to tell you I'm an expert on clean language, but not on EAGALA, and I love learning about it. So hopefully this is a good example. All right, so I've taken this is not the beginning of a session. We're in the middle of a session. And this horse has come up to this client, let us say. And I believe in your model, and one of the things I love about the EAGALA model is it seems to be very fluid and it's ever learning and adjusting, and I think that's so fabulous to be open to always tweaking. But my understanding, at least, is that the facilitator might say something like, let's use a clean language question, is there anything else about that horse who's turning away and sticking out his tongue? Now, in Grovian clean language, that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Why? Because those descriptive words are not the client's words. And you're trying to direct the client's attention to where your attention's going, if you're the facilitator, to the turn of the head and the sticking out the tongue. But what if the client were to say, and you say, this is my preferred clean language question for this would be, and what's happening now? Because then you invite the client to tell you where her attention is. What if she were to say, his eyes are looking elsewhere and he's smelling me? Ooh, nothing about the tongue. I could get carried away with that fun example, but so let's say, though, the client says he's got his tongue out. And he's got his tongue out. And is there anything else about that tongue out? So notice how slowly, how I'm spreading the words out. He's savoring life. Now, I defy you to tell me that if you were out there in the field, that's what you'd thought she'd say. It's one of the things about using that pacing is you invite this answer that comes from a different place than this cognitive, logical place. And savoring life. And what kind of life is that life he's savoring? It's like he's tasting the air. It's a subtle savoring. And a subtle savoring. Tasting the air. And what could he know about subtle savoring? Now notice she'd only called him he. So I didn't call him the horse. I didn't call him any. I used her pronoun. She's not going to be confused by that. She used it. It's her word. It's not confusing. And what could he know? And you can gesture. What could he know about subtle savoring? He knows there are important parts of life we overlook. Now, how many questions have I asked? 3. Did you anticipate we were going to go from tongue out to important parts of life we overlook? Probably not. And what do you know about subtle savoring? I know I can still savor little things. Even though I'm grieving, I can do both, and that's okay. Whoa, so she's taken it back to what she's there for, without you having said anything. It's still in her mind, even if you hadn't been hearing about it for 20 minutes. And notice that that's okay. She's gotten permission. There's permission in that statement, and that's okay. So there's a whole new avenue to explore. Where's that permission coming from? Is she giving it to herself? Does it come from the voice of the parent? Why did she think it wasn't okay? So not that you'd ever ask why. I just mean that just note how subtly you suddenly got permission in there. Okay, let's take the same example again. Pretend it's a different client. He's got his tongue out. And he's got his tongue out. And is there anything else about that tongue out? He's dissing me. And he's dissing you. And when he's dissing you, what would you like to have happen? I want him to see the real me. And see the real you. And what kind of you is the real you? It's a me I don't let people see. And just because of space, I stopped doing all the repetitions here. And it's a you don't let people see. And what could he know about the real you don't let people see? Oh, I thought he was dissing me, but he's saying, phooey, that's not the real you you're showing me. And you want him to see the real you. And it's a you don't let people see. And what do you know? What do you know about the real you don't let people see? I know I need to be willing to show the real me, but it doesn't feel safe. So some people ask me, with this solution-oriented approach, what our fundamental question is, what would you like to have happen there? But you're future-oriented and you're not dealing with the here and now and you're not dealing with problems. That seems too limited a focus. The problems are going to come up. The person is going to be playing out their patterns as they explore their metaphors. You're giving them a solution focus so they have a vision of where they want to go to, which is motivating and encouraging, but the problems will reveal themselves, such as it doesn't feel safe. So you noticed I asked the same questions as I did in that last example, with the exception of adding the one, what would you like to have happen, because she had come up with what looked like a problem. That's what you say to a problem. Same questions, same process, same structure, entirely different content. So with clean language questions, to quote Mies van der Rohe, less is more. It uses simple words, they're generally quite short, they avoid unnecessary words, and they interrupt the client's self-reflection as little as possible. So why stay clean? If I haven't already convinced you, let me tell you about Shelley. Why use the client's exact words? Shelley was one of my early clients, and she came in for one session, and she was going to the dentist after our session, and having some major dental work done. And so her desired outcome for the day was to be able to go in and literally open herself up to the dentist and let him do what he needed to do. And that may not sound like that big a deal, but she had a history of sexual abuse. And so allowing a man to get into her mouth was something that took a lot of work on her part. So she had some comment. I honestly have forgotten what the clean language question was, something she said about, and I'm proud of myself for doing this. And I can remember thinking something about the way she phrased it, that if I was just using conversation, if I was being grammatically correct, I would have said, and is there anything else about pride? And I thought, no, be clean, use her word. Whether it sounds grammatically correct or not is irrelevant. It won't matter one bit to the client because they're her words. And so I said, is there anything else about that proud? And she said, it's got OU in it. Well, it would never have occurred to me to point that out. So I said, is there anything else about OU? And she said, yeah, you know what? Courage has OU in it. And so does shout. And so does loud. And I'm going to shout out loud. And I've got a lot of courage, and I'm really proud of myself. And she started getting really animated. And she was thrilled. And then she started getting into this thing about, part of the thing had been to, money was tight. She was helping her son get through college and helping him with loans. And so spending this money on herself was a big step for her. So she started talking about how this was like IOU has OU in it. And so this was all about the son and the money. And after a while, I had no idea what she was talking about, but I was just thrilled with her because she was thrilled. And I'm back there thinking, thank God I didn't change proud to pride, because she would never have discovered all those associations. And look how empowered she is walking out of this office. And one more story. I know I'm getting short on time. 5 minutes, okay. But let me tell you about Kevin. Kevin was a phone client, and he called me and said that he had, well, it took a while to find out, that he was an alcoholic who had fallen off the wagon. I'm not a licensed clinician. I don't work with addiction, but I did finish this session with him, and then we talked about what was more appropriate. But I found this so interesting because he'd fallen off the wagon, and focusing on his resources, and said, "Oh, you've been on the wagon, and how long were you on?" And he was 4 or 5 years. And I said, "Oh, then you know a lot about helping yourself. This is great. You're really an expert on you." And he'd been in AA, and so we started getting into metaphor. And I don't even remember what his original desired outcome was, because what I remember that was so interesting was we got to his a 5-year-old self who was up a tree. And I can remember thinking, you can't help but have assumptions. It's just when you think cleanly, you become aware that they're assumptions, and you hold them lightly. And the clean language helps discipline you not to talk about those. So he tells me he's up a tree, and I remember thinking, oh, he's this angry little boy. Thank goodness I didn't say, and must have been angry, because he wasn't angry. I thought he was fearful, but it turns out he was angry. He said he was up there with his arms crossed, and he said, "I'm not getting down, and you can't make me, and I don't care what you say." So we did this whole metaphor thing, and eventually he gets this ladder, and he comes out of the tree, and he goes to some village, and there's a fountain, and there's a dam, but the dam is blocked, and the water's not flowing, and it hasn't filled up the quarry, and he gets rid of the dam, and the quarry fills up, and he plays with other children, and this is what metaphorical landscapes sound like. They're great. And the conclusion he came to, the insight he had from this, is that that little boy up in the tree was not allowing anyone to help him. And he had to come out of that tree before he would open himself to getting help. So after that session, I had some contact with him, and he got himself a sponsor and got back into AA. And I thought, thank goodness I used clean. Because the assumption, had I been trained perhaps in drug and alcohol thing, would be to have talked about something completely different. You've got to get into AA, or you've got to do this, you've got to do that. It wouldn't have been to just trust the client. He knew what he needed to do first. What he needed to do first was get that 5-year-old to open up to help. So this is the subtlety of assumptions we can make and the wisdom of the client. All right, so we've run out of time. Let me look and see if there's anything, last thing I just have to tell you. I was going to tell you about David's emergent knowledge work, but you'll just have to read my next book, which will be out next month. Sorry about that. Let me see how I can get my little picture back. Okay. Doesn't want to come. There we go. There's my whole next part of my talk. Let me just end with a quote. You do poetry therapy, you'll have a poem for everything. But it strikes me that this is very much about what you do with your teams in the field, with your clients, and particularly working with space. To create a space for all our words, drawing us to listen inward and outward, transforming our broken fragments into an eternal continuity that keeps us. So thank you very much for having me. I will be around the rest of the conference. I'm looking forward to it very much. I'm around if you have questions or comments you want to share. And go forth and be clean.